This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm NETTLE, and it's Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. In one of last week's MTG Top 10s, I looked at one of the most aggressive stat lines in the entire game, 1 mana, 2 1s. I thought it would be interesting to follow that up this week with a look at an even more aggressive 1 mana stat line, 1 mana, 2 2s. Unlike 1 mana, 2 1s, which often come with upside these days, 1 mana, 2 2s still tend to come with some downside to even out the fact that they are so efficient. Despite that, 1 mana, 2 2s tend to find some success when they are printed. There have only been 28 of them in the long history of the game, but 16 of those have at least 1 point using my scoring system. Before we get to the list, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. I top 8 at a Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, Mythic Invitational, Legacy, or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a top 8 at a Magic Fest or Grand Prix is worth 1 point. At number 10, it is WAYWARD Guide Beast, which is by far the newest card to make this list. This 1 mana 2-2 doesn't just come with good stats, it also has a couple of keywords in Trample and Haste. While Trample isn't the most impressive thing ever on a 2-2, having Haste does mean this can represent a really quick clock. However, it does come with a pretty sizable downside. When it does damage to a player, you have to return a land to your hand. This means that playing it on turn 1 and attacking right away isn't always going to be what you want to do. However, mono-red aggro decks and Pioneer are perfectly happy operating with just a couple of lands in play, and those decks like to have the Guide Beast in the deck as a result. Those decks don't ever really intend on having more than a few lands, so the downside is minimized and you just get a really efficient creature. I think it's fairly likely WAYWARD Guide Beast gains more points in the future, which means it's likely to move up this list. At number 9, it is Carnophage, one of Magic's earliest 1 mana 2-2s. This card's efficiency is balanced by the fact that you have to pay 1 life every turn or tap it, but that's not really a big downside if you're an aggro deck. After all, you just want to lower your opponent to 0 as quickly as possible, and if you don't do it quickly enough, you're probably going to lose anyway, so losing a few life to speed things up is worth it. Carnophage was featured in Suicide Black, a black aggro deck that got its name from the fact that it ran lots of efficient creatures with hefty downsides, like the Carnophage here. Suicide Black decks found success in both Extended and Legacy. At number 8, it is Glinthawk. This 1 mana 2-2 comes with flying, which is pretty awesome. It can come down and represent a very quick clock on your opponent, especially when it's joined by some friends, but of course it does have a downside. When it enters the battlefield, you have to sacrifice it if you don't return an artifact to your hand. The idea there is that it prevents you from being able to play it on turn 1 in most scenarios. Luckily for Glinthawk though, it was printed in an artifact-heavy set, and one of the big decks in both block and standard was Tempered Steel Aggro. These decks ran lots of cheap artifact creatures, including Memnite. Playing Memnite, then the Hawk, then the Memnite again on turn 1 is pretty scary. Glinthawk doesn't have any points since 2011. At number 7, it is Pouncing Jaguar. It has the same overall score as Glinthawk, but it has more Pro Tour top 8, so I gave it the edge. This 1 mana 2-2 comes with Echo as its downside, which, in this case, means you have to pay a single green mana the turn after you cast it, or it gets sacrificed. While that certainly is a significant downside, after all in some ways it makes it a 2 mana 2-2 that you pay for over the course of 2 turns, the Jaguar, despite that, is still a great 1-drop for mono-green aggro decks, and it saw a lot of play in those decks in Urza's Block Constructed and Standard. At number 6, it is GOLDMEADOW Stalwart. If you aren't playing a Kithkin deck, it's pretty difficult to cast this as a 1 mana 2-2, since you have to pay 3 additional mana to cast it if you don't reveal a Kithkin in your hand. That is a really steep price to pay, so, obviously enough, the Stalwart was only played in Kithkin tribal decks, which were successful in both block and standard. In those decks, the Stalwart was pretty close to a 1 mana 2-2 with no downside at all. At number 5, it is Isamaru, Hound of Khanda. Isamaru doesn't have any downside printed in its text box, so it's pretty close to a straight up 1 mana 2-2, which is pretty great. However, there is some small downside that you'll find on its type line. It's legendary. This certainly does make Isamaru worse in most ways. After all, if you're an aggro deck, you want a critical mass of awesome 1-drops, but because Isamaru is legendary, one has to consider whether running a full 4 of them is too many. After all, you can't really play your additional copies if Isamaru is already in play, and that's a huge bummer. Still, Isamaru is small enough and dies often enough that the downside isn't massive, but most decks that have played Isamaru over the years tend to only play 3 copies instead of 4. And that is downside even if it is minimal. Between 2005 and 2009, Isamaru was one of the premier 1-drops for aggro decks in block, standard, and extended. And number 4, it is ZURGO, BELLSTRIKER, another legendary 1-mana 2/2. ZURGO also comes with the downside of not being able to block creatures with power 2 or greater, but that downside is fairly minimal, since if you're playing ZURGO, you're probably playing a deck that isn't really planning on blocking anyway. ZURGO also has the upside of dash, which lets you play it for an alternate cost to give it haste and have it returned to your hand at the end of your turn. That upside is also not a huge deal, since most of the time, you'd rather just cast ZURGO for half the mana, but sometimes giving him haste lets you do lethal right away, so it does come up on occasion, and is just upside. As you would expect, ZURGO was played in standard aggro decks. More recently, it's also gained points in Pioneer mono-red aggro decks. ZURGO seems like a good candidate to gain more points going forward. And number 3, it is DIREGRAF GHOUL. This 1-mana 2/2 zombie comes with the downside of entering the battlefield tapped. That's not a big downside, since as I just noticed when talking about ZURGO, most decks running a 1-mana 2/2 aren't planning on blocking a whole lot anyway. In addition to just being an efficient, aggressive creature, the Ghoul's zombie type also ended up being pretty critical in making sure it saw a fair bit of play. DIREGRAF GHOUL gained all of its points in mono-black and black-red aggro decks in standard, all of which featured a zombie sub-theme as a result of running Gravecrawler. You could play Gravecrawler in turn 1 and then attack with it into a blocker, or maybe your opponent removes it. Then on turn 2, you can just play the Ghoul and get the Gravecrawler back. That's a pretty powerful sequence. DIREGRAF GHOUL hasn't gained any points since rotating out of standard. At number 2, it is NETTLE Sentinel. This 1-mana 2/2 won't untap during your untap step, but it will untap anytime you play a green spell. Basically, NETTLE Sentinel needs a deck loaded up with cheap green spells to be at its best, and the good news is, it just so happens that other elves are also cheap green spells. And in most decks that run the Sentinel, it has more upside than downside. When combined with cards like Heritage Druid and Wirewood Symbiote, you end up with a pretty impressive mana engine, where you return elves and recast them to untap the Druid and other elves who can all produce mana thanks to Heritage Druid. This combo was powerful enough with the right elves around, but it got even sillier and extended thanks to Glimpse of Nature, where combining all of those also meant ripping through your entire deck before killing an opponent with something like Grape Shot. Because of how consistent this deck was, Glimpse of Nature got banned out of Extended, and when the Modern format was created, Glimpse was preemptively banned. However, the combo can still be played in Legacy. In that version of the deck, the win condition is usually Crater Hoof Behemoth. Even with Glimpse banned, NETTLE Sentinel has also managed some points in Modern, where elves can still go crazy with a bunch of mana-producing elves, either just straight up winning with elf aggro, or going crazy wide and using Azuri Renegade Leader to end the game. NETTLE Sentinel is likely to continue to gain points, and it isn't that far behind the number 1 card on this list, which is Goblin Guide. This number 1 probably doesn't come as a huge surprise to anybody. Goblin Guide is a 1-mana 2/2 with haste, and it can do a ton of damage in a hurry, and sure, it does come with the downside. Your opponent gets to look at the top card of their library when it attacks, and if it's a land, they get to draw it. And that is a real downside, make no mistake, but Goblin Guide tends to make opponents dead quickly enough that giving them extra cards doesn't really matter, and the effect isn't even 100% downside, as it does give you a bit of information about your opponent's deck and hand. In Standard, the guide was played in a variety of aggro decks like Landfall, Naya, and Boros, but it was also played in more typical mono-red aggro decks. The guide, being printed in 2009, was also around for the waning years of Extended, where it managed a few points. Modern has been where it has really thrived, though, being one of the best turn 1 plays for decks like Burn, Death Shadow Zoo, and of course mono-red aggro. Like NETTLE Sentinel, it continues to gain points, but the two are close enough that it's hard to say who will come out on top in the end. Well, those are the 10 best 1-mana 2/2s that have had the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you want to own any of these hyper-aggressive creatures, you can buy them at Card Kingdom. In the description, you'll find a link to take you directly to each of the cards in this video. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on the MTG Top 10s I've already done, including others that look at creature stat lines, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Finally, if you like my content on this channel, consider checking out my other YouTube channel, Need to Hone History, where I talk about real-world history. Thanks for watching.